The audio you're about to hear was recorded in Anchor. Learn more at anchor.fm.
You're listening to Pretty Dece, the bite-sized audio blog about games, comics, movies, and more, featuring news, reviews, opinions, and impressions. So if you're a geek, we hope you think it's Pretty Dece. What's up, everybody? This is Pretty Dece for April 4th, 2017, and today, this past weekend, went down to my local comic shop, Downtown Comics in downtown Indianapolis. Shout out to them. And I was just perusing, looking for something new to read, and came upon a book entitled, I have it here in my hand, Street Fighter Cross G.I. Joe. I looked at that and I thought, that's relevant to my interests. Growing up, I was a huge Street Fighter fan, still a pretty big Street Fighter fan, but it was one of my favorite games on the original Genesis, Street Fighter 2 Special Championship Edition, and I love all the characters, really love 2D fighting games in general, and Street Fighter is the king of those. And of course, G.I. Joe. I absolutely adore G.I. Joe. I really liked the cartoon growing up as a kid. G.I. Joe comics, I read tons and tons of those. The Marvel era, I really liked the Devil's Due Press era of G.I. Joe comics. Collected almost that entire run. Yeah, I'm a big fan kind of both of those properties. And this is put out by IDW. And, this is something that they do a lot, these kind of crossover comics they've done. I think, G.I. Joe crossed over with Transformers, crossed over with, various other properties. I think, Star Trek at some point. So, they're very, eye-catching on the shelf, as this one caught my eye. And, I hadn't really ever, dove into one of them, so I picked this one up because this is kind of the most interested I've been in one of them. Then I started flipping through it, and I realized that it was written by Aubrey Sitterson, who I'm actually familiar with him and his work. He's a pretty cool dude. He's into the things that I'm into. He's into wrestling. He does a wrestling podcast every week called Straight Shoot, which is very good. He writes fantasy. He's working on a continual podcast / narrative called Scald. And, he's just into metal and rock and roll and he's into comics and he's into writing comics as well. So he's actually, this seems like it was his first foray into G.I. Joe, and now he actually has just recently, as of I think December, started writing the G.I. Joe monthly series for IDW. So, Aubrey is the go-to G.I. Joe guy now. So, I dove into this book, and the premise, the setup here is that M. Bison and Destro are running a fighting tournament. So they're running a street fighting tournament, just as is the plot for a lot of the, Street Fighter games. And of course, there's something going on behind the scenes. There's reasons that the tournament has to be happening, and, spoiler alert, it's that M. Bison, has some secret plans, and Destro wants to kind of double cross him and make the plans beneficial to him instead. And most of the book is actually based around fights. So every issue is kind of based around a series of fights. So you go through the fights in order. And it jumps right into it, first of all. There's really no preamble. You jump right into starting into the fights. And, it's very fan servicey. If you're coming here expecting some, kind of deep story, that it is not that. But you will get a pretty fun story. I had a really good time reading it. And, you have to be a fan of both series coming in, first of all. They're not gonna explain who these characters are to you, aside from a tiny little blurbs for each individual character to tell you, broadest of terms what they are. You need to understand who all of these people are in order to get some of the gags and in order to understand, really why things are funny and why things are happening. get a lot of really cool, images in the art. So like one of my favorites was, you get Guile doing his exact same pose that he does in his game over image from Street Fighter 2. So like that's cool. You would have to like be very familiar with Street Fighter 2 to even pick up on that. So that's really cool to see. And then there's some really cool interactions and fights, like character pairings that work really well and I think are really cool. You get to see the G.I. Joe Gung Ho fight the Street Fighter Guile, and they're both, military men, Guile being an Air Force guy. And it's really cool. So the Guile jokes that, after Gung Ho trash talks him, he says, the Joes let their enlisted men talk to officers like that? And, that's a really cool fight. So, Guile gets to joke about, he knows how to fly, and he does his flying bicycle kick. So whenever there are fights like that, you do get, especially in the Street Fighter characters, you get to see like their actual unique attacks. You get to see sonic booms, you get to see Hadokens, you get to see all of those things, in comic form, which is really cool. One of my other favorite fights was, Chun-Li. She was facing Dan. If you don't know who Dan is, in Street Fighter lore, Dan is a character. He wears a pink gi, and the joke with Dan is that he is super, super weak, that he has no power whatsoever. So the character is literally just not as effective. His punches do less damage, his kicks do less damage, his fireball that he shoots is like goes nowhere, just fizzles out. So, Dan is a joke character, and he's sort of like a handicap, right? If you're like really good at the game, you try to get good at Dan and still beat people with Dan to show them just how good you actually are. So anyway, Dan shows up for a fight, and we get some typical Dan jokes where he is not as strong as he thinks he is and stuff. But come to find out, Dan is actually Zartan in disguise. So he's actually the G.I. Joe villain, the Dreadnought villain, who's known for and whose whole thing is disguise, and he's actually disguised himself as Dan. That's a really cool moment for him to show up. And then we come to my absolute favorite fight in the book. Storm Shadow is fighting the Croc Master. And they're essentially, Storm Shadow is going to throw this match, is what they've decided. He's going to, let Crocmaster win, and it becomes completely pro wrestling. Crocmaster talks about going over, which is a pro wrestling term for getting the win. And then they talk about putting on a show, and they're just having some fun. And like all of the references and all the talk clearly come from Aubrey Sitterson knowing about wrestling and wanting to sprinkle in some of those pro wrestling terms. So that's really, really fun for me, and because I'm a huge pro wrestling fan as well. Side note, we haven't talked about wrestling yet, but we definitely will. Wrestling will be a future episode, for sure. But yeah, I liked the kind of the little nod to pro wrestling here for those two characters. Then at the end of the book, I won't spoil kind of what happens, but, it does involve M. Bison. M. Bison does have some psycho powers, and we see one of the other Street Fighter characters get psycho powers, and kind of the most just ridiculous thing happening, and it's silly and fun. So yeah, overall, like I said, the book, not deep, there's not a lot of depth here, but for like a fun, super fan servicey thing where you get to see some fun pairings between Street Fighter and G.I. Joe characters. Yeah, I had a really good time. I'd love to see a second run at this book, and I'd love to see maybe, Aubrey Sitterson write it now that he's like kind of getting his feet wet with more and more G.I. Joe stuff. And I'd like to see it not in the structure of a tournament. So let them actually just team up for some other reason. Have maybe the Secret Service Street Fighter characters sort of go join up with the G.I. Joes for some reason or something, and have some other reason for them to be there. Forcing it into that structure of that fight did make it a bit more surface level and bland kind of than it could have been otherwise. So it would have been nice to have a bit more plot going on in the book. But still, again, very, very, very fun. Happy that I picked it up, and it's certainly a fun thing to put on a shelf and have people go, oh, wait, there's a Street Fighter cross G.I. Joe? Weird. So yeah, overall, I think Street Fighter cross G.I. Joe is pretty decent. So that's going to do it for us today. Thank you very much for joining us. If you like Pretty Dece, like what you hear, want to hear more, please favorite the show in Anchor, and we'll show up first in your list every single day, so you'll hear all of our bite-sized daily episodes. If you would like to let me know what you think about various things, anything geeky, anything under the sun, use the call-in button in Anchor. Press call in, record your message, and it'll show up right in my app, and I'll be able to hear it, and I'll include it in a future show. If you would like to keep up with Pretty Dece every day,